Okay, Ignacio.
Welcome everybody to this event on Building Back Fairer, Equality in the Post-COVID World, which is organized by the UN Inequalities Task Team. My name is Ignacio Saiz. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and I will be moderating today's panel, which brings together some of the leading civil society voices on the issue of inequality in the current context. And before saying a few introductory words, I want to commend the UN task team, the Inequalities task team, for opening this space to hear civil society perspectives on these issues. The pandemic has laid bare the pervasive and interconnected nature of inequalities of all kinds. In country after country, we've seen the direct health impacts falling disproportionately on racialized groups, particularly Afro-descendant and indigenous people. Here in the US, where I live, for example, hospitalization rates have been 3 times higher amongst African Americans and indigenous peoples than other populations. We've witnessed stark gender disparities in terms of the economic impacts of the pandemic, with the gender poverty gap estimated to have widened over this time, due in part to the role women play in the decimated informal economy. And nothing illustrates the injustice of inequality between countries more powerfully than the global apartheid that we're seeing in access to vaccines, with the vast majority of vaccine doses produced so far having gone to the richest countries, while regions such as sub-Saharan Africa have received less than 2%. These disparities are neither accidental nor inevitable. They are the result of unjust economic and social policies pursued over the last 4 decades, which have tended to fuel disparities rather than mitigate them. Waves of austerity measures, the weakening of public health and social protection systems, the undermining of labor rights, the undervaluing of women's unpaid care work, these have all created the pre-existing conditions for these intersecting inequalities to flourish in the COVID context. Now, many in the human rights community have been pointing out for years that these policies are diametrically at odds with governments' human rights commitments to ensure substantive equality, to fulfill economic and social rights for all, including by devoting available resources in ways that realize economic and social rights progressively and without discrimination. And the persistence of these policies has also made a mockery of the pledge that governments made recently to leave no one behind in the global agenda for sustainable development, an agenda which includes a groundbreaking goal, SDG 10, to reduce inequalities within and between countries, a goal which is under review today as we speak at the high-level political forum, as well as far-reaching commitments to achieve gender equality. What's remarkable about the moment that we're in is how it surfaced the interconnectedness of the different policy shifts that are needed to tackle inequality. So struggles for universal health coverage and for labor rights have been shown to be deeply interrelated with struggles for gender and racial justice. The resistance to austerity is now being waged in much closer collaboration with campaigns for tax, debt, and trade justice, and to broader questions of fiscal space and international cooperation. So my point is that by illuminating these issues and inequities simultaneously, the pandemic has shone a very powerful spotlight on the systemic injustice at the core of our current economic model and on the fallacies and falsehoods that are sustaining it, in the words of the UN Secretary General. So this session takes as its starting point that we are now at a critical inflection point. More and more people are questioning the morality of an economic system which results in scarcity and precarity for the many, and yet continues to generate unimaginable wealth for the few. Our premise is that this should be an opportunity to build back fairer as well as better. And building back fairer means going beyond the palliative responses to the crisis that we've seen that merely cushion its shocks, and instead tackling the root causes of inequality by transforming the economic paradigm that fuels them. increasingly many of us in broader civil society and within the human rights community are asking, how can we use this juncture to bring about a rights-based economy, one that guarantees the conditions necessary for all people to live with dignity on a flourishing planet? And it's a question that I'm delighted to hear Michelle Bachelet recently pose when she talked about the need for a human rights economy at a recent Human Rights Council forum. So a central question or overarching question that we'll be exploring today is, how can we leverage the human rights and sustainable development commitments that governments have already made to challenge regressive responses to the current crisis, but also to envision rights-based and equality-enhancing alternatives in the wake of COVID-19? What would a rights-based economy look like? How can we more effectively deploy human rights norms, narratives, and strategies to bring that vision about? Now, we could not have a more ideal set of panelists to address these and other related questions. I'm delighted to say that we have Jayati Ghosh, who is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, formerly at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. We have Isabel Ortiz, who is director of the Global Social Justice Program at the Institute for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University in New York. And we have Max Lawson, head of inequality policy at Oxfam International. So before I hand over to our panelists, I want to stress that this is not just an academic discussion. This is not just another HLPF talking shop. It has a very practical purpose and outcome, which is to inform the work of the UN Inequalities Task Team, which has organized this session. Now, the task team is an interagency initiative of 22 UN bodies, which is led by OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and UN Women. And this task team is coordinating the UN's work to follow up on the inequality commitments of Agenda 2030, and specifically SDG 10 and its relationship to SDG 5 and other SDGs. The task team is tasked with implementing something called the UN's Shared Framework for Action on Inequality, and I would urge you to look at it. Perhaps we can share the link in the chat. It's a remarkable document that highlights, amongst other things, the imperative to reduce inequalities and to challenge the dominant economic model with a human rights approach. So this will be a fairly interactive conversation, I'm hoping, between our panelists. There will be the opportunity for you in the broader audience to ask questions over the chat. My colleagues at OHCHR and UN Women will be grouping the questions together so as to maximize our time, and I will be handing over to them to cluster and call out some of the questions from all of you. But let me begin by turning to you, Jayati. Your work has spanned a huge range of economic and social justice issues, especially focused on economic inequalities. And you've often focused on the need to support sustainable livelihoods as a means to address these inequalities. How would you assess the global policy response to COVID so far? To what extent do you feel it has helped people withstand the health and economic shocks that COVID has produced and the great disparities in those impacts?
Well, thank you very much, Ignacio. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I have to say, I'm so pleased that you got my pronunciation of my name correct. It's so rare nowadays that I feel particularly honored about that. You know, I would say the trouble is really that there isn't one global policy response. There are very disparate ones, but the starkness of the difference between developed and developing countries is absolutely shocking. I'm sure Isabel will have a lot more to say about the different fiscal response in the countries, but just, you know, something that the IMF brought out quite recently is very telling in this regard. Of the approximately 10 trillion, 9.93 trillion additional public spending since January 2020 to March 2021, 80% comes from just 10 rich countries. And 54% comes from just the US. If you look at the per capita spending, it is in excess of $25,000 per capita in the US. That's even before the latest proposals of the Biden administration come into force. It's $2 per capita in the low-income countries. We are talking about, differences that are beyond contemplation. Now, this is happening in a context in which, as we know, the developing world actually needs protection and compensation much more during something like a pandemic, because first of all, there's much higher informality. 70% of workers are informal in the developing countries compared to only 20% in the advanced economies. In some countries like India, it's 90% of workers are informal. That means they have no legal or social protection. There's nothing to help them when lockdowns say that you cannot work, when you cannot earn your livelihood, when you lose your job. There's no protection. So the need for government spending is even greater. I would argue it's not just about protection and welfare, it's compensation. It is governments that have deprived people of the possibility of earning their livelihoods. So it would really be seen as a just compensation for being deprived. We have seen almost nothing of that in most of the developing world. So the policy response, except for a very few striking outliers, which, and you can really count them on the fingers of one hand. Other than that, most of the developing world, the compensation has been extremely inadequate. It hasn't been up to what is required. In some countries like India, I regret to say it is so low that we're going to see massive increases in poverty. The estimates are anything between 100 to 250 million increase in absolute income poverty, massive increases in hunger because of the livelihood collapse. It's not only about food supply concerns. It's really now that people do not have the money. They don't have the entitlements to buy food. And so there's this massive nutrition and food crisis. There is the health spending, which is still very, very low. Many countries are still spending more on debt servicing than they are on health, even now, 1.5 years after the pandemic started. And it hasn't gone up. Health workers are still the most underprivileged and the least compensated in many of the developing countries. And finally, just to mention the absence of something to deal with the huge digital divide in education, because so much education across the world has moved online, even in countries where there is no online, if you see what I mean. There is no connectivity, there is no possibility, or there's one mobile phone per household. So the idea of school education operating through online education, which has somehow taken root all over the world. And yet we do not have the kinds of spending that would enable, which really means we're not just thinking now of a lost year or two, we could even be thinking of a lost generation in terms of jobs, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of capabilities as well. So the inequalities that were already stark, people kept saying COVID is shining a light on the inequalities. No, it's not, it's increasing them. They're massively increasing over this period.
Thank you, Jayati. Can you zero in a little bit on the particular impacts on women? I mean, you've mentioned the impact of informality and the role that women play in the informal economy, but what should be done to tackle gender discrimination in responses to the pandemic? And what will precipitate what will help, to be able to challenge the gender discrimination and the gender disparities in the economic impacts of COVID, and also gender disparities and discrimination in the responses to it?
So, I would really say that there are 5 ways in which the sort of gender discrimination has become very apparent during COVID and has accentuated as well. The first is the rationing out of work, and of decent work in particular. We know that this tends to happen anyway, whenever, whatever are the good jobs, women tend to get rationed out of them. When there are very few jobs altogether, women get rationed out of even those. We have seen this across the world. Disproportionately, women have lost employment. And this is, hugely evident, that therefore less access to money incomes. But in addition, more women are informal workers, more women are in precarious work and in self-employment. And these are the activities that have been the most damaged. So that even the ones who are working in informal work, who are seen as essential workers, and everybody goes out there and bangs plates to support them and sing songs for them from their balconies, but they are not getting better wages, they're not getting better working conditions, they're not even getting the basic physical protection that they need during the pandemic. And because labor market situations have worsened so dramatically, many of them are now working at lower wages. So there's that angle. Then there's the huge increase in unpaid work. And this, of course, I mean, it's evident even in the developed countries because, children are at home, elderly people, the access to care services has greatly diminished. So the burden of care has increased dramatically. The burden of a range of other indirect care, as it's called, just provisioning for the household, all of that has increased. And this disproportionately falls on women as well, as we know. Then there's the loss of nutrition. And I want to emphasize this in developing countries, it's very big. Women, when there's less food, women and girls get less within the household. And we are seeing this now in many, many developing countries. And again, this has huge health implications as well. And finally, I want to highlight an aspect that doesn't get talked about so much, which is the massive increase in domestic violence. Lockdowns, the absence of adequate or the disappearance of adequate public welfare measures for women who are facing this kind of violence has really been a very, very disastrous kind. And as conditions get worse, we know this all over the world, men tend to take it out on those whom they can take it out on. And that is usually the women and girls within the household. So that's another huge concern. What do we do about this? Well, of course, you need a whole package of measures. But if I had to highlight just one central thing, I think it's the increase in public employment on good terms, that is to say, decent work in public employment. Why? It's absolutely key, first of all, because it provides the essential services. So we are under providing all of these care services, as I mentioned. We need to double, triple, quadruple the number of public workers. We need to pay them properly, recognize them as workers, give them basic conditions, give them all the protections that are associated with them. We know that disproportionately they will be women, but we also know that they will reduce the unpaid work burden. They will add to the other kinds of protection that women need, including these kinds of things like, protection against domestic violence and all of these kinds of help. And we also know that this is a huge area in which if you generate more employment, you will actually create multiplier effects that cause a bubbling up of economic activity rather than a trickle down. So if I had to say, what can we do about it? Begin by dramatically increasing public employment, especially in care services, and on good terms.
Thank you, Jayati. This is an excellent segue to the question I had for Isabel, which is, investment in public services and public employment requires fiscal resources, the mobilization of resources to enable that. Isabel, you've long been tracking the issue of austerity, of fiscal austerity, and its human impacts. Your recent study of austerity worldwide paints a very, very sobering picture. In spite of all the rhetoric that we were hearing about the need for expansionary fiscal policies to create fiscal space, especially in the global south, the reality is that many countries, as you've demonstrated, many countries are already planning or implementing budget cuts that will threaten the kind of investment in public services that Jayati was talking about, that will threaten social protection, job creation, and much more. So can you please share with us a little more about what your research is telling us, and particularly how austerity exacerbates inequalities of all kinds, economic, gender, and other?
Thanks, Ignacio. Let me start by saying that, yes, we have been tracking austerity cuts over the years with United Nations, with governments, and with civil society organizations. And the reason being that this is really a not needed policy. It has major negative social impacts. It impedes progress in human rights, and it creates inequalities. So it's really an outdated policy that should not be happening. And unfortunately, many governments opted for it during the so-called austerity decade, which was from 2010 to 2019. Then, as you say, the pandemic came, and then it was, a number of investments, emergency investments by governments. And the bad news, and the reason why we launched the latest global austerity alert based on IMF fiscal projections, is that just as soon as this year a majority of world countries will be cutting public expenditure in terms of GDP. And we're talking about 154 countries this year and as many as 159 countries next year. And there are a total of 192 countries. So it means the majority of world countries will be cutting. And the severity of the severity of the cuts is larger than it was during after the financial global crisis in 2010. So these are not good news. In terms of people affected, more than 6.6 billion people, or 85% of the world population, are going to be suffering austerity this year and next year. We're talking about a huge amount, of people that will be suffering unnecessarily unless we do something. And the good news are that these are IMF fiscal projections done by IMF economists. They are public information. They're in the IMF website, but it does not mean that it's going to happen. This is what IMF economists, in discussion with the ministries of finance of the countries, predict and forecast that's going to happen. But it's not too late. There's still actions that can be done. And the first thing that I think we need to do is to be vigilant to the types of cuts. And there are 5 types of main cuts that we have been experiencing in earlier years, and they seem to be replicated at the moment. And I'm going to mention them because they are very important for human rights. So I think it's very relevant and inequalities for this conversation. The first type of adjustment that is always done, there are wage bill cuts or caps, and that means cutting the number of the salary of civil servants. And generally, if you look at the budget of a country, the large majority of civil servants are teachers and health workers, social workers, and civil servants at the local level. All of them are fundamental for the advancement of human rights in countries and public services. So it is fundamental that to avoid this type of cut. Second has been cutting or phasing out subsidies, mostly fuel, but also food subsidies. And we are talking at a moment where food prices are again at record heights, as high as they were in about the financial crisis. So you see, these type of cuts have negative impacts on household income from a number of reasons. To start with, because fuel subsidy cuts generally have an impact on the prices of transport, and the prices of transport affect everything, not just physical transport of people, but also goods and services. So ultimately, it impacts the whole economy. The third more common reform has been reforms to pension and social security. And this has obvious negative social impact because the reforms have been focused only on sustainability and not really looking at equity considerations. As any reform has to be done, balancing both equity and sustainability. So as a result, when I was director of ILO, we did projections and we saw that pensioners around the world are actually going to receive much lower pensions in the future as a result of the current social security reforms, and which is obviously against the human right to social security. Then a fourth reform, it is the rationalization of social protection, and that has been to a focus on targeting safety nets, doing them very minimal and very targeted to the poorest or most vulnerable. Now, of course, you have to protect the poorest and most vulnerable, but this is about protecting everybody in need, no matter. They may be also vulnerable people that might not be among this group of the poorest. And the reality is the commitment of the SDGs was to expand social protection. So we get, universal social protection coverage that has been agreed internationally by, in numerous summits. And reality is that these targeting safety nets are making them minimal for cost saving, and it's actually a contraction of social protection, not expansion. And the last most normal measure has been labor flexibility reforms, which really are at the cost of workers, to try to support entrepreneurs and enterprises at a time of fiscal difficulty. However, it should not be workers who carry the weight of the negative impact. Generally, this has been accompanied by a wave of increasing VAT taxes, consumption taxes, instead of increasing other types of taxes that will be progressive, like income and wealth taxes, and also privatization, which is also inadequate. So we need to be aware of all these measures and try to denounce them if they occur, because the reality is these measures are not needed at all. There are alternatives. There are alternatives that are really known by all countries, that have been fully endorsed by the United Nations and the international financial institutions, and they have been applied by governments over decades. And there are at least eight financing options that governments can do to really first try them before going to any austerity cut. And if I have time, I can just enumerate the fiscal space options or the financing options that they exist in all countries, even in the poorest countries. Okay, so first of all, will be increasing taxation. Very obviously, this is something that is increasing progressive taxation will be a way to go to ensure implementation of the SDGs and human rights and reduction of inequalities. And this will be of the many types of taxation, of possible taxes, which are there: consumption, to real estate, to imports, exports, to wealth and income. Really, you want to focus on the progressive ones, the ones that tax those individuals or corporations that have more income. And we have phenomenal examples from recent history. Brazil, for instance, implemented a financial transaction tax for 50 years, and it was extremely successful with it. Mongolia or Zambia did actually expand social protection through, small increases on taxation to mineral extraction. And that was actually very successful too. Second option will be, second financing option will be to increase social security coverage. And that means turning people from the informal sector to the formal sector, giving them good contracts, and also ensuring that they contribute to social security. And this will be a way to expand social protection. And many developing countries have done very successfully, like Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Tunisia. Third will be to fight illicit financial flows, and these are illegal. So we do have to fight them. It means things like money laundering, tax evasion. We do really need to fight them. And these amounts will be much larger than another option. That will be fourth option, will be aid and transfers. We can ask for lobby, particularly low-income countries, for more aid and transfers. And there are interesting proposals put forward, like the Social Protection Fund. However, the amounts for it and transfers are small, so countries need to look to other of the financing options. Fifth option will be restructure or reduce debt, and they are very successful cases happen in the last decades. About 60 countries managed to reduce debt through different mechanisms. Six will be to tap into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves, and that sounds something very complicated. It really means that many countries have lots of reserves accumulated in the central bank. And let me give you an example that is actually criminal. In many sub-Saharan countries, sub-Saharan Africa countries, where there is a real food security problem, you have central banks actually accumulating lots of central bank reserves for a kind of conservative policy. But what are they doing there? There's a kind of rule of gold that is to keep about 4 months of exports. But these countries are accumulating much more there. So when your population has very dire needs, you do need to attend to populations before that, keeping these reserves in your central bank. Seventh will be to adopt a more accommodative macroeconomic framework, and eight, to reallocate public expenditures from sectors that might have no social benefits, for instance, defense, and use them for health, education, and others. And we have very good examples. For instance, Thailand and Costa Rica changed the defense budget for health, and it was a phenomenal way to expand health. So these alternatives have happened in different countries. They are fully endorsed by the United Nations and the international financial institutions, and they must be discussed in social dialogue. These are cannot be technocratic, decisions taken behind closed doors in the Ministry of Finance by a few technocrats. They are too important to the lives of people. So yes, the SDGs and human rights, it can be achieved if countries and governments look to these financing options.
Wonderful, Isabel. Thank you for that very helpful typology of austerity measures, but also laying out so clearly the alternatives that are available to austerity, which remind us that austerity is not only unjust and unequal, it's unnecessary. So let me pass to Max. I'm just conscious of time. I want to pass to Max. So Oxfam has been campaigning on the issue of inequalities for more than a decade now, including most recently on the issue of vaccine inequalities, the vaccine apartheid issue. So as a campaigning organization, reading the political dynamics around this, do you think that the pandemic has made the kinds of systemic change that both Isabel and Jayati were talking about, has it made it more or less likely? And why would you argue so?
Well, first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to join in. I think I've been working myself personally on inequality at Oxfam for nearly a decade. And I'm glad that my pay is not performance related, because during that time, inequality has got much, much, much worse. So clearly we're not doing enough campaigning, and we've just got the latest numbers on where the billionaire wealth has gone just in the last 5-6 months, and it is off the charts. I mean, we're not just talking about bouncing back from the coronavirus crisis. When we did our Davos report this year in January, their wealth had already returned to its pre-crisis highs in 7 or 8 months. With a huge increase. Since then, we've seen another new 500 billionaires and another $2.4 trillion worth of wealth in just 6 months. It's like a 30% increase in billionaire wealth in the last few months. So, and the first thing to say is, inequality's not getting any better. And I think it's clear from the work we obviously the data at national level is delayed, and we have to wait for household surveys and things like that. But I think you can do certain things to get a picture of what COVID's going to do to inequality, not least what Jayati and Isabel have been speaking about so eloquently. You know, the harm at the bottom, destroying wages at the bottom, particularly for women, combined with this massive increase in wealth, that you don't have to be Thomas Piketty to work out what's going to happen. But I think we also did a survey of as many economists as we could from all over the world. And I've got it here. We got nearly 300 economists from 80 countries around the world. We just asked them a simple question: do you think inequality is going to increase or increase dramatically because of COVID-19? And we got 85% of them said it would increase dramatically or at least significantly. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say that probably for the first time in our lifetimes, maybe the first time in history, we're going to see inequality increase in almost every single country on the planet at once. But that's, to my knowledge, that's never happened before. We've had different periods in different regions, but this is really a kind of uniform explosion in inequality. But then I would also echo what Isabel said, that, you know, it's still not too late to mitigate the worst impacts of that. In the same way that a doubling down on austerity will make it even worse, equally, the kinds of reforms that would make it a lot better and that would maybe give impetus to SDG 10, which has been somewhat moribund since it was agreed, you know, that we need systematic plans at country level where they set targets to reduce their Gini coefficient, to reduce the level of inequality, and set plans to do that. And we did some numbers with the World Bank for our Davos paper about the kind of different scenarios and in terms of poverty. And I would say for us, critically, we mean poverty at the higher poverty lines of like $5.50, that kind of level. I think we don't really think that extreme poverty should really be discussed anymore. If we look, the one thing we learned from this crisis is that the vast majority of humanity is just a paycheck away from destitution, and we can't say that this is some, you know, rapidly disappearing group of extremely poor people that we can just fix with a few you know, neoliberal reforms. That, you know, we have a structurally deeply unequal world, and COVID has shown that to us all. So do I think that there are positives? I think I think we certainly learn as a movement from the financial crisis, and I think we were a lot more ready this time in terms of fighting hard on progressive reforms. I think we are seeing the kinds of shifts, at least in the narrative. If you look at the Biden administration and global tax reform, I would cite that as quite a dramatic shift in narrative from the most powerful nation on earth, where we all apparently want to end the race to the bottom now. It wasn't even recognised by most leaders very recently. So I think I could see positives in there, and I also seen some countries, particularly Latin America, start to implement wealth taxes, talk about solidarity taxes, and but it's really small things at the minute. And I would say on the social protection side, yes, you did see some quite, particularly in the countries that are rich, some quite sweeping actions at the beginning of COVID-19, and a sense that kind of if there was one thing, it's just this sense that being poor or being close to being poor is not your fault. I think that if I'm thinking about the narrative in Europe, that's that right-wing trope that increasingly got more and more powerful, that the reason you lost your job is because you're lazy. I think this crisis has shown everyone that we're all fragile. I think we need to fight to build on that and to build kind of collective responses as a result. And I think there are countries that are doing good things. We heard some examples from Isabel. I can think of others. And some of them are very poor. I mean, some of the things that Togo did, for instance, they had a safety net for informal workers. When I was living in Kenya, when the crisis hit, there was nothing. People were just sent home, just as it was in India. People just had no support from government. They were left on their own. That's a very big difference between two countries in Africa, So there is possibility, but it won't happen unless we fight for it, is the short answer. And don't ask me to lead it, because inequality will just get worse.
Well, I was going to say, it depends what the performance-related benchmark is that you're talking about. If it's reducing inequality, then no, you've done a lousy job. But if it's raising awareness of inequality, then I think that's a different story. And Oxfam should be credited for the enormous service it's provided to the world for really underscoring that, putting the issue of inequalities on the political agenda. So I want to pick up on your last point, which is about how we resist the regressive agenda that is being perpetuated, and how we advance a more progressive and more holistic vision of economic alternatives. And so what do you see what are you seeing as Oxfam in terms of how civil society groups, social movements are responding to and catalyzing the kind of changes that we all agree need to happen? Are you seeing progress there in terms of, for example, greater alignment or convergence across different tribes of activism, across different sectors, different movements? What can you say about the response from civil society and social movements?
It's a really good question, Ignacio. When I saw it and it's a very hard one as well. Again, speaking honestly, since the crisis started, it has been a campaigning opportunity, first of all, on debt cancellation, which we all came together to kind of fight for and get at least some semblance of cancellation, and for a much larger group of countries than we've ever had recognized before in these kind of debt negotiations. And then there's been this big kind of fight around SDRs, the special drawing rights, which again has led to an issuance of $650 billion worth of SDRs, which is not a small thing. So that it's this kind of crisis-unity at the global level. We did see these things happen, and then I've personally spent the last 6 months of my life almost entirely focused on the patents issue, because we do see another opportunity there to kind of break through and see some kind of structural change on the issue of patents and pharmaceuticals, using this, I hate to call it an opportunity because it's so horrific, the level of vaccine apartheid that we're seeing, to basically shed a light on the insane inequities in the global system of pharmaceutical production. So I see civil society coming together in those spaces. You know, it's been wonderful, for instance, to see how supportive Greenpeace have been of the people's vaccine, you know, and the whole, you would think they would be really cross because climate change is also incredibly important this year, but they instead see a real read across to, like, if we can't fix what is a relatively simple problem of vaccinating the world, how on earth are we going to fix the problem of climate change? You know, there's the sense in which we have to come together to challenge this vaccine apartheid. So I have seen a lot of solidarity and a lot of kind of all hands on deck feel about it, which has been really, really positive, I'll be honest. And we had that a little bit after the financial crisis with the financial transaction tax, which Isabel alluded to. You know, the global campaign for that was, again, something that saw unions, saw church groups. You know, you had the Pope coming out one day, you had, yeah, and there's a bit of that about the people's vaccine too. So that's really positive. And I really hope we can get somewhere, because I think if there's one thing that motivates people, it's a level of victory, you know, and actually securing some things that will make a difference to people's lives. And that's so rare in our business, as we well know. And most of our lives are spent trying to stop bad things happening. But yeah, let's hope we can certainly get quite a few good things to happen too.
Thanks, Max. That certainly resonates with what we're seeing at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, a much greater alignment, convergence, or willingness to work together, and an awareness that across different movements, I mean, you know, movements for debt justice, tax justice, human rights, labor rights, in a way that I think was missing after the global financial crisis. And I think it's something that stands out now. Maybe we've learned from that experience. And there's certainly an appetite and a desire for working together to kind of envision the broader systemic paradigm shift that that each of us have been talking about from our distinct perspectives. So these have been incredibly rich thoughts from all three of you. I just want to throw out a kind of cross-cutting question to all, based on kind of what you've been saying. You know, all of you have pointed to how the policies that have been in place for the last 40 years and the policies that are being proposed and perpetuated post and even in the context of COVID are, you know, pulling in the wrong direction. They're contradicting the goals and the commitments of the Sustainable Development Agenda. They breach human rights commitments. I want to move to the how. We're all agreed that's the case, but how do we leverage these? How do we leverage the SDGs? I mean, SDG 10 is being discussed today. Is it a meaningless piece of paper, or, you know, how practically can we, as I say, leverage and deploy the sustainable development commitments, the human rights commitments that governments, you know, the vast majority of governments have signed up to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. How do we make use of that fact practically to resist the political dynamics that we're confronting? How can countries of the global south, for example, use those commitments to revert the imposition of austerity? So the how question. Can you reflect a little bit on how do we use these? As I said to you, this is a practical strategy conversation. We want practical recommendations. So we don't have to go in the same order, but I'm seeing from your face, Jayati, that you're raring to go. So
not raring to go, because this is an incredibly difficult question, but I was also quite struck by several questions in the chat and in the Q&A about LDCs in particular. And it's true that LDCs, it seems like an impossible task, right? Because you really are powerless in the global system. You're facing huge debt burdens. You have, you know, your exports have collapsed. If you had tourism, that's collapsed, and all of that kind of thing. So it can feel like a hopeless endeavor. And then there's the other issue, which is that, you know, each time when things get so bad, we think this is a tipping point. And I don't know how many times in the last decade I've thought this is the tipping point, and then it doesn't tip, right? And so you have to think, okay, what is it that would make it tip? So I think there are two things that I would recommend, and they really stem from what Max was saying about, the fact that this certainly has made a lot of international movements work together in ways that they were not thinking before. Perhaps it's also time now within nations for activist social movements to force their governments to work together with others. Because, an individual LDC, it's absolutely true, has no power, but a group of them, it's actually quite significant. And the ways in which that is routinely not exercised, whether it's tax justice, I mean, Max knows, right, the kinds of struggles that are going on. But it's very difficult to get it. I mean, supposing we had the group of African countries saying, well, we are going to impose this unitary tax on the multinationals that operate in our region. And it's very different from a few countries saying this. If they say we will impose a minimum royalty on all the minerals that are extracted, it's very different from an individual country. So I think combining has a big advantage. I think some of it is already happening. I believe that there's the Organization for African Unity is actually talking about industrial policy for vaccines. Perhaps Max will know more about this, because now they've realized there's no point in waiting for handouts from the North or from the charity that will never come, that will leave you deprived for years while the pandemic rages. So you're already getting moves towards regional industrial policy because you realize that that's the only way you can do that. I think many, many more of us should push our governments at least towards regional coordination, collaboration, cooperation, because that's one way to exert bargaining power in the global context. It's not enough, obviously, and ideally we would like international cooperation, but hey, let's not kid ourselves. It's not happening anytime soon. And I think G7 has made it very, very clear that and even G20 is likely to make that clear. So maybe groups of countries now need to get together and use the collective to create greater strength. And the other thing I would just mention is that one way to get our national governments to be a little bit more responsive is through the comparison thing. I was very interested in the Togo example, I think Max raised, which I wasn't aware of. But I wonder whether knowing that your neighbor Togo has done something which you blatantly haven't, and when you spread that news among your society, maybe that creates some kind of a response. I know that the Indian government, which does nothing for its own people at the moment, nothing, gets absolutely outraged when it's ranked below Pakistan on anything. I mean, we're routinely ranked below Bangladesh now, but when you're ranked below Pakistan, that's maybe we should use those things to push our governments, certainly on SDG 10, but on all of these SDGs, because again, being completely honest, there is a sense in which a lot of bureaucrats and government policymakers, legislators, they listen very politely and they mouth all the right things about the SDGs, but you can see them rolling their eyes. They're not taking it seriously. The way to make them take it seriously is to sort of shame them into it in a way.
Excellent. Thank you, Jayati. I'm going to use your phrase to pose that question to you, Isabel. What will make this a tipping point?
Thanks, Ignacio. It's always a very good question, what to do specifically. I agree with Jayati. I would like to point, what can the UN do, or which is very relevant to the discussion today. Realities also could apply to civil society organizations. And I would like to start by the country level. The thing at country level, the first thing you do is to see the situation in the country. So check, is the country going to start with austerity cuts? And for that, you can check our global austerity alert, or Oxfam has a phenomenal austerity tracker too, or other organizations, and above all, the IMF, that will be the best source of all. And check the original source. And then once you have determined if the country is going to do austerity cuts and what is the current situation with respect to human rights and the SDGs, then state them, So this is where it seems we're going to go now. But however, this is where we should be going to have inclusive societies that respond to people. And so once you have the gap, then what you do is to call for national dialogue. And I think that is something that the UN, as part of good governance, has been doing in many countries to to call for this national dialogue. And for that, you do need some type of assessment of what is the situation. It needs to be rapid, however. You cannot have these assessments that are, encyclopedic and take 1 year to be done, because the austerity cuts, for instance, are done very, very quickly. It can be within weeks. So it means that, you call for dialogue, you do a really rapid assessment of the potential negative impacts of austerity cuts and the alternatives. How can they, so you open the avenues for dialogue. What might be the alternatives for that country? Is the debt large? Are illegal financial flows large? Are many, I don't know, how are the funds redistributed between the different ministries? Is, defense getting a lot and health very little? This type of questions. Then put all the options there for national dialogue that needs to be open and participatory with trade unions, employers, civil society, of course, government, and the UN can play a conciliatory role in organizing all that. This has been traditionally doing that. Also, the assessments, and so once you do that, and it's a public debate, you ensure again that this does not become a technocratic decision, taken behind closed doors by a few technocrats at the Ministry of Finance. These decisions impact the lives of so many people, you see. So you need to show the impacts on women, on children, on elder persons, on youth, and what will be the alternatives, so everybody, somehow you get a consensus on where to go. And that already will generate a difference in policy making. At regional level, that will be very important, what Jajatik was saying, because the thing is, countries can do, but then by associating regionally, you might do more. The UN also, is very good on bringing regional groups of countries together and bringing regional meetings and calling the messages. And so at the global level, so you could do that, the same exercise, at different levels, national, regional, global, and try to get consensus on a different recovery that will be, people friendly and respond to everybody, to the majority of people.
Thank you, Isabel. Max, how would you add to this this campaigning list of shifts that are needed to make this a tipping point?
Well, I'm not sure this is Oxfam policy, but I think, we were talking to a fantastic economist in Zambia yesterday for the podcast that we run, and he was talking about how well the Socialist Party of Zambia are doing in the elections. And I think, those on the progressive left tend to be scared about talking about what's required. What we need is more left-wing social movements, and particularly in Africa, which is, since structural adjustment, has been like an ideology-free zone. We have fantastic activists, amazing civil society working on corruption or water or health access, and nothing really that brings them together with a kind of coherent political project. And that way they can be played off against each other, and we don't see significant progress. So I think, whether it's behind the need to fight inequality is a kind of maybe that's a less exclusionary banner maybe than all being lining up behind a red flag, but there's certainly the point being that there's a coherent need to make a more progressive society, and then making politics about that in country after country. I don't think there's any shortcut to that, and I think for a long time civil societies thought that there was. So that's why we as Oxfam, we moved more into the inequality space and shifting all of the terms of debate, because we think that's what throws open the possibilities on things like tax or ending privatization in healthcare, or more progressive ways to address climate chaos. I mean, individual policies. I say that I'm busy campaigning on the patents issue because I think there's one policy we can win. So I'm just a complete hypocrite. But I do think there is a way that we need to look at the way things come together, and at country level, especially having lived in Kenya the last 4 or 5 years, it's just really missing that coherence of thought and political action. And until we get that, we won't get the change we need.
That's a very insightful point, and I think some of the positive examples that you and others have mentioned have come about in terms of responses to the pandemic, have really come about because of broader progressive agendas in the countries concerned, and they've been part of a political project to introduce wealth taxes, or to challenge unjust debt dynamics. And I think it's something that for some of us in the human rights community, that can be a challenge. The human rights community comes from a tradition of kind of agnosticism on broader systems, or a fetishization of political independence that often inhibits it from making a more political case for the realization of rights, and that's probably what you were alluding to, Max, when you said you're not speaking in the name of Oxfam policy. And I think it's something we need to revisit, and certainly we at CSR see that the advancing human rights is a political project. That doesn't mean it needs to be tainted or politically partisan, but it is an inherently political process. And I think there's an awareness in the current context that is the case. So I want to hand over here a little later than planned to Laura and others at UN Women and OHCHR, who've been monitoring the chat and collating responses. Apologies for having squeezed the time for this, but we were getting carried away in substantive conversation. So who is going to help me, or who's going to voice the questions that are coming up in the chat?
I'm going to make a start on that, Ignacio. Thanks very much to all the panelists for a fantastic set of interventions. And we've actually had loads and loads of questions on the chat, which has been great. So we've been frantically trying to cluster them together. So I have 3 sort of clustered questions here. We've put them under headings to start us off, and then if we have time, there'll be another set as well. So the first set is about talking about this issue of public spending, and in particular least developed countries. And I think people want to know a little bit more about sort of specific recommendations on how the least developed countries who are most challenged in terms of having the fiscal space to respond to the pandemic can find the resources to fund an increase in public spending on social protection, healthcare, and other public services. And then another one, which also relates to this issue of fiscal space and the role of the international financial institutions. One questioner has pointed out that it seems like the trajectory in responding to the crisis is slightly different this time, as both the IMF and the OECD accepted in the early days the need for fiscal expansion, but they're also, as Isabel has pointed out, supporting austerity policies with no willingness to address the systemic issues of indebtedness, tax abuse, etc. So the question is, how can we address or maybe exploit this contradiction between those public statements and policy on the ground? So that's the first set on public spending and least developed countries. And then we have a question on people really picking up on this issue of change. So much agreement on the need for change, but how do we translate that need into action on the ground? So the dominant prescriptions of the past 40+ years have been devastating for human rights, for development, for peace, and for the environment. And this has rendered national economies powerless to respond to the COVID crisis. So the narrative is shifting. We hear a lot about that, but do you see any real evidence of an actual policy change in key financial and trade institutions at the national and international level? Or is this shifting narrative all talk? And then along a similar line, someone was commenting, if 25 years later, governments are still unable to really implement CEDAW, it is hard to see commitment, CEDAW being the UN Convention on Eliminating Discrimination Against Women. It's hard to see commitment on reducing inequalities. Will the UN be able to leverage this in time at scale? And this person suggesting that collective voice or revolution that demands social justice may be the only way forward. That's already quite a lot. Shall I stop there for now? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, Laura, for collating those questions and packaging them in that coherent way. It's a lot to ask of our panelists, and I'm going to very generously give you 5 minutes each to respond. You don't need to respond to everything. Just take the question that you feel you can most contribute on. And I know you, all three of you can contribute on all three questions, but the ones that you want to zoom in on. I'm sorry, but for reasons of time, I'm going to have to limit you each to 5 minutes. So who would like to go first and take any one of those questions?
Okay, I'll go since both of them are busy thinking and putting down thoughts. And let me begin with the last thing. Is revolution the only way forward? You know, the trouble is I'm old enough to remember, you know, all these things about how only drastic, complete overhauls, etc., will work. And then you realize that actually change happens through all kinds of chipping away at things. And the ones that you think are going to be drastic overhauls often end up creating worse situations later. So I think that I agree with the argument that the narrative is shifting, but a lot of it is talk still. Nonetheless, the fact that the narrative is shifting is important, because narratives have a major hold on public imagination. And we're not going to get the change till we actually change that. So I would say, yes, CEDAW is still not implemented. CEDAW is not going to be implemented for a while because it is huge. I mean, CEDAW is like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It will give us, not utopia, but it'll give us as close to a decent progressive equality that we can imagine. So we don't say that until we've got it all, you know, nothing has happened. We say, let's think of the things we can change, which are the levers. And I do believe these will be different in different countries or societies. But I think for individual activists and people trying to make change, we have to grab the things that capture public imagination. And let's face it, the right wing has managed that. The right wing, whether in the US or in India or in a bunch of other countries, has managed either to shift the public imagination or capture something that for some reason picks on some latent kind of thing. We have to be able to do something not similar, but we have to be able to find things that capture public imagination and then create a broad coalition. So I would argue that for social movements, there are a few things that are important. One is something that to pick something relatively simple and easy to grasp, or at least that we are able to make it appear very simple and not so complicated that, you know, they can buzz around it and destroy it for people. To make it something that a broad coalition of people will be willing to support, and not to say, not to have untouchables with amongst us, not to say, well, you know, you were against us for that other policy, so we're not going to be with you now. Be willing to accept a broad coalition as possible. To highlight the contradictions in existing stances. I think that point, I'm picking up on the earlier point. There's a huge contradiction between what the head of the IMF and the chief economist of the IMF say and what they're doing on the ground. Let's keep unpacking that. Let's keep quoting their leadership back at them. Let's keep pointing out how they're saying one thing for the developed world and another thing for developing countries, even when the situation is actually worse in the developing world. Let's keep poking holes in that contradiction. When G7 makes a broad statement about how they want, you know, to ensure equitable vaccines, let's pick on them. Let's highlight that huge discrepancy between what they're saying and what they're doing. And let's go on and on battering it down. And I think, therefore, pick a few things. I think Max is absolutely right to focus on a few things. He's done a great job. I have huge respect for the way Oxfam has picked on the IPR issue and the vaccine apartheid and really gone on about it and made a difference. But let's pick on a few things that capture the public imagination. Let's take as broad a coalition as possible, and let's keep chipping away at it instead of saying that, you know, it's not the best possible thing, so we're not going to do it. Yeah.
Thank you, Jayati. Who wants to follow? Max?
I can, Isabel, if you, I don't mind going next. I was going to say, something struck me in what, as always, in what Jayati said, but I do think, you know, when we run campaigns trainings in Oxfam, I get people to bring in an example of the most successful right-wing campaign, because the best campaigns of the last 50 years have been on the other side of the political fence, and absolute genius. And I often think, you know, the ambition and the ability to move the goalposts, you know, and the fact that people I always picture a bunch of probably white men sitting around in the 1970s. They didn't have whiteboards then, so they probably had a flip chart or something, and they were saying, right, someone wrote on it an end to corporate tax. At that time the corporate tax rate was 50%, and then a few other guys laughed, and they think, now that's the kind of ambition we need. Like, we need to constantly move the goalposts and constantly think big and think about amazing things that can happen. And then again, learning from the right, you have your profound objective, but they are very good at working together. You think they fight each other all the time, but they don't. They do manage. All these right-wing think tanks who are competing for the same billionaire funding all seem to work together in a way that the left seems incapable of doing. So I think, and they will go for specific policy wins, and they'll really try and get them to prove a point. So it isn't either or. I think you need to say the big things and really float those fly those kites, of really profound change, but at the same time seize the opportunities when they come along. And I think, yeah, you can see progress in that way. And I think it does feel different in that sense to the few years after the financial crisis. I think neoliberalism is certainly not dead, but it's much more kind of zombified and hidden and hiding behind populism, and it's certainly not nearly as brazen as it was 20 years ago. So we need to keep fighting until we completely get rid of it. Zombies are not very good at dying.
I was just going to say, the problem is zombies don't die, so we need to find the lethal weapon. Isabel.
See, well, let me start by clarifying about the IMF. Actually, that has been highly confusing, of course, because the IMF has been an institution supporting austerity cuts, so-called fiscal consolidation. And then suddenly the management, as Jajati was very well saying, started saying, no, we're saying the opposite. Actually, they meant the opposite during 2020, during the beginning of the pandemic, up to the beginning of 2021. After that, they mean austerity. Austerity is back in business. And there is a contradiction, of course, between what management says or the research department says that is much more fine-tuned, and what country economists do. That's very important to take in mind. But also there's a change between the policies proposed in 2020, which was kind of fiscal expansion, to after, which the projections of the IMF show that it starts this year until at least 2025. Okay, so the tune now is going to be back on fiscal consolidation, which is the new name for austerity cuts. And there's so many things to comment in the questions and in the comments that people have been doing. Max had some very interesting comments too, and I was kind of dying to add to them. First, because it is true, talking about the left or the rise of opposition to governments. Now, there are tons of polls that show that actually the dissatisfaction with governments is growing. And we're doing another study that we're evaluating more than 3,000 protests occurring in 2006. And it's very interesting to see what has happened over time. So from 2006, you would have a number of protests. They keep increasing. There's a massive increase about 2010, which is when the impacts of the financial crisis get stronger because the fiscal stimulus ends and austerity cuts start. And then they keep on, but then the composition of their changes. You have like a more issue protests in 2000 up to 2012, like people protest that reform in education, or they protest for specific civil rights, or they're protest about women's situation, or gay, lesbian, or labor reform, you name it, it's an issue. From 2013. 14 onwards, where you start saying is this omnibus protest. And by that, it means that they're protests that include everything, because people are irritated and tired. They're protesting, they don't see results. Democracies are not delivering for them. So then they protest many things at the same time. And and if you look at who protests, this is very interesting. You had earlier, you had typical protesters were activists, trade unionists, now what you have is much the middle classes are protesting to. They are concerned about their pension, about their, young people might be concerned because they don't have jobs, etc. So you do have a number of the middle class protesting. And in terms of alliances, this is very important. This is just a reflection of inequality trends. So what we have been saying is actually the middle classes have been shrinking their share of the total income in a large majority of countries, not all, but in a large number of countries. So the reality is the typical alliance that it was with the middle class, with the upper classes, it seems to be being weakened or eroded. And now actually middle classes feel highly dissatisfied with governments. They think they're not delivering for them. And actually like low income people too. So, but this alliance has not yet happened with them. So we're in a transition moment. Reality is that governments, as we were saying at the beginning, don't need to do this austerity policy. They don't need to do these neoliberal policies. They are not necessary at all. This is an outdated policy that, thought decades ago. And zombies, as Max was saying, are hard to die. So it is really a decision, a public decision of governments, of political parties, and of citizens ultimately, to decide if you want your government to be minimalistic, not delivering the services that will help to achieve human rights, or on the contrary, if you want, good governments with good governance that will allow you to develop all the public services needed and all the development needed to bring prosperity to all citizens. And that's doable.
Brilliant, thank you, Isabel. Laura, let's take a final crop of questions at risk of abusing our patient panelists and firing too many questions at them. But Laura, do we have a few more that we can?
We do. Sally-Ann's going to voice these ones. Over to Sally-Ann.
Hi, and thank you. We have a few more questions, which we've also clustered around a number of issues, and thank you to all the participants for so many great questions. Another cluster of questions is around global inequalities, and we know that SDG 10 is about inequalities within countries, but also between countries, so that global aspect is important. And then another cluster around human rights, and another brief one around environmental issues. So just to start off with the global inequalities, some of the audience listening are thinking about how the current crisis is related to global inequalities. And for example, one question was around how the current response to global pandemics is clearly not working well. And there are proposals for a new global pandemic treaty, but this will involve negotiations, which is often difficult for less developed countries because they have less capacity to negotiate. So how do you see global inequalities intersecting with the COVID crisis, and how can we make sure that global responses in the future are more equitable and challenge the existing global inequalities? So that's one question around the pandemic. And then a similar or related question is around, again, around global inequalities. How do you see older patterns of dependency, colonialism, feeding into the current crisis, feeding into inequalities, and feeding into issues like we're seeing around the vaccine and inequities around the distribution of vaccines? So that's one cluster around global inequalities. Then we have, just quickly, we have a cluster around human rights. And one audience was asking, we know that in times of crisis, we often see arising anti-human rights agendas and a backlash against gender equality. How are we seeing this in response to COVID, and how can we respond to this from a pro human rights side, and then how can we make sure that we put people first, not just now in public policies in the immediate crisis, but permanently putting people first in the long term? And is such a thing as the human rights economy really possible? And just finally, a quick question around environment and fossil fuels. Our speakers were talking about, especially Isabel Ortiz, about the elimination of subsidies, especially for fossil fuels, which is important for environmental reasons. But this has negative impacts too in terms of costs for people's lives, in terms of their food costs, their transportation costs. So how do we balance this? What can we do to balance out that impact between the subsidies and the impact on people? I hope that's not too many questions. Ignacio, I leave that to you to manage. Thank you.
Three huge clusters of questions, three brilliant panelists, 12 minutes before I have to wrap up and close the session. So that means you each have strictly 4 minutes to answer any aspect of the questions that Sally Ann just posed for us.
This time I'm not going first.
I could. I don't mind. Isabel, do you want to go? Or I don't mind.
I think it's better that you go on, because all the work you are doing with the vaccines and all that, your message will be more important.
We're wasting our minutes being polite, aren't we? So I wasn't actually going to say that though. Yeah, I do think in some ways the last year feels quite old-fashioned, because I think we've got into a more nuanced discussion about inequality within countries after the financial crisis. Because I just remember the kind of peak Tony Blair, make poverty history, Bono type, rich world, poor world dynamic that we got into, and then we managed to kind of push through that and see that there is grotesque inequality. You know, we have 1 million people in Britain going hungry every week. You know, the idea that there's this that everything's fine in the rich world, and then suddenly this vaccine thing comes along and the COVID crisis comes along, and you really do see these kind of colonial things. I think one of the questions mentioned it, that kind of these paths of dependency and colonialism laid bare again, you know. And I think we need to remember that the struggle is about both global inequality and national inequality, and bringing those two movements together in a way that I kind of think happened better around Seattle and those kinds of years. And maybe, you know, post-financial crisis with Occupy was a bit too much about national inequality, maybe a bit not enough about these. And they do create enormous tensions. You know, right now, JRT will really recognise this. Like, Modi is one of our champions on the patents issue. You know what I mean? India is fighting for patent-free access to vaccines. I mean, the man is an awful, 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 terrible man. You know, so if you want your developing countries to be heroes and push back against the rich world, then sometimes you can have some strange bedfellows. So it's not always as straightforward as we're going to work on both. But I do think this has shown the power of the rich world, the absolute hideous global inequality, and the racism as well. I mean, the blatant racism around vaccines, the stuff around kind of, oh, brown people in poor countries could never make vaccines. You know, this is the thing that only white men in nice clean factories in North America can make. You know, it's just obscene and alive and well, sadly. So yeah, I think we need to keep fighting not just economic inequality globally, but racial and gender inequality very much there. I'll stop because that's more than my 4 minutes.
Thank you, Max. Jayati, I'm tempted to go to you because I know these issues are so close to your heart and your work.
Yeah, just a footnote on Mr. Modi. You know, the Indian government hasn't issued a compulsory license for a vaccine made in India, which it could have done a year ago. So there's a lot of hypocrisy even in the Indian government position, unfortunately, which doesn't mean that we don't support it in the WTO. Of course we do, but we also lay bare the hypocrisy that is going on in India, which is restricting vaccine production in India as we speak. Yeah, I mean, the vaccine passport is another example of colonialism. And then we're back to the 19th century, right, where Europeans could go around the globe and basically bash everybody they met. And nobody else could come to Europe. So yeah, we're certainly, all of those inequalities are hugely prevalent. But I want to get rather to the combination of issues that was raised, that there's a backlash against human rights, women's rights, etc., in times of crisis. And there is also actually a backlash against environmental standards, both. So we are seeing across the developing world active investment in fossil fuels, in more carbon emitting projects, because you're desperate to revive economic growth, no matter how. These are being funded by regional development banks and by all the bond markets and so on. So there's a lot of push to do all the wrong things. It's not just preventing the good things, but it's moving in the wrong direction as well. Once again, I really believe people are not aware of this. I'm sure that, in the developed world, if they realize what was really happening with IPRs and vaccines, the average citizen would not support the government saying we will not share a technology. And similarly, I'm sure that if people knew that their governments were going in for massive environmental deregulation and more fossil fuel subsidies, they would not support this. Having said that, the issue of balancing is absolutely crucial. India now has the highest oil prices in the world. Yeah, we have per capita income, which is maybe 1/35 of the global average. We have the highest fossil fuel prices. We have the highest, because the government is using this very regressive form of indirect taxation to put the entire burden on the people rather than taxing the rich. But it is not accompanied by more green investments. It's accompanied by more fossil fuel investments, actually. So, this whole notion that a carbon tax will solve the problem, which is a very simplistic response of a lot of green environmentalists, is misplaced. And the Indian example shows this very, very clearly. 98% of the price of petrol in India is tax. And it falls on ordinary people. As Isabel said, it enters the price of everything else because of transport. And yet it does not mean that there is a shift towards greener technologies. So we really have to have a much more aware discussion of the ways in which policies are playing out. Sometimes it's not only just a kind of inevitable contradiction that you can't do anything about. Sometimes it is a contradiction that you can do something about. And I think that's where we need to focus.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jayati. Isabel, on any of those questions.
Yes, so what to say? To wrap up, really picking up with how Jayati started the discussion, reality is the investments needed for recovery are monumental. If we consider particularly developing countries, we do need major efforts still done on emergency healthcare that has been undermined because of years of austerity. And these investments need to happen, the vaccine efforts need to happen, but then still we also need major investments to ensure that economics activities, pick up, and then support the population through different social protection measures. So these major investments are going to be needed. Austerity really is the last thing countries need at this moment. It's on the contrary, they need fiscal expansion. We have said that there are these at least 8 financing sources that have been fully endorsed by the United Nations and by the international financial institutions, and governments have been applying them for decades. So it's the time of governments to be creative, innovative, to really explore these financing options. And the importance to address inclusive societies that permit the advancement on human rights, which have been kind of sidelined for many years now after the global financial crisis. So we do need to do that. Now, say that kind of the world is in a strange moment. Anything can happen. We might go the wrong way. We might go the right way. But there are signs of the right way too. Multilateralism needs to pick up after the annus horribilis of the Trump administration. Now we are back with the Biden administration to a moment in which multilateralism may pick up. If not, it is very important then to move towards regionalism. Jayati was right too. So try to move countries. And we had very good examples of excellent regionalism happening in many areas. Latin America, for instance, the creation of UNASUR. Literally all countries belong to one regional bloc. So it is important then to also have that, because at least countries are not left isolated. And in all, these are different, these are the needs. And then we'll have, it is really our generational duty to make this happen. You know, we're here now. We have, you know, the intellectual knowledge on how to do things. So it is really, we must put all our efforts to try to move a progressive agenda forward that makes a change in the lives of people.
Brilliant. One little coda question, footnote question to each of you, and please don't take more than 1 minute to answer it. It was buried in the cluster of questions that Salian mentioned. This concept of a rights-based economy, does it have legs? Is that something that can be a useful rallying, something to rally around? Can it converge and link with other progressive visions that are coming from the feminist movement, from the indigenous movements? You know, what I mentioned this because Michelle Bachelet has started talking, as I said, about the human rights economy. Organizations like ours at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, our current strategy is all about envisioning a rights-based economy and catalyzing cross-movement action around it. What's your honest opinion? Rights-based economy, does that have legs, traction? Your thoughts, 1 minute each.
Okay, yes, it does. And I would put it in the category of the big ideas that Max was talking about. You know, I mean, the more Pellerin society, I mean, if you can go with a capital-based economy, that we should be pushing a rights-based economy. And I think that is a huge umbrella notion under which you can bring together all kinds of different groups, different approaches, different perspectives. So yes, definitely it has legs. We have to have that ambition and confidence. And we have to stop being so tentative about it. Because yes, it may not happen tomorrow, but you put it out there and you keep pushing and you keep pushing and you have a long-term agenda. I think we can get there. Yeah.
Wonderful. Let me agree with Jajati. Yes, it's a good idea. It's a visionary idea, so you keep moving it. And in my work, in some places, actually, you may hear it in places like Chile, and it's not accidental that Michelle Bachelet is from Chile. In countries where they believe, you know, like that citizens are in the streets because they want a new constitution, you know, then the talk of rights, it is much stronger. It might not happen in other places where this is not happening, but still, you see, you always have pioneers that are the ones, the movers and shakers that they start mobilizing the ideas. So yes.
Max.
No, I'm completely against. No, I do. I think it's a mobilizer. I think it's particularly a mobilizer for young people. I think the examples are from Latin America, but also in the global north, particularly around Black Lives Matter. And I think if you look at what brings people together, it's a sense that you know, we do want a future based on rights, not based on capital. So yes, I think it can really work. I've been really inspired with Amnesty and the People's Vaccine Campaign, all the work they're doing on social and economic rights as well. It really feels that bridge has really been built, that it is just as much about labour rights as it is about the right to protest, you know, and I think if that can all come together in one coherent vision, that's a wonderful thing, yeah.
Excellent. Well, we're going to have to enlist you all as champions and visionaries of the rights-based economy. You know, sometimes we get the reaction, oh, that sounds kind of so utopian and so fanciful, but we've lived for 40 plus years with the notion of the economy is all about guaranteeing the freedom of the market. I mean, what an absurd notion of, and perverse notion of freedom and rights, to put the freedom of the market at the center of it rather than, you know, people's dignity. So why is that so utopian? Why is that so outlandish? So wonderful. Thank you. This amazing panel has been, I think, not just very insightful, but also inspiring. I hope you're, all of you participating are as inspired as I am. I also really welcome the fact that this has been a very propositional discussion. And despite the very dire context which we've all described and analyzed, some really concrete and positive and inspiring things have come out of this discussion. We've highlighted that there is momentum for change, that this really does feel to many of us like an inflection point, like a tipping point. It's not going to happen of its own accord. Things need to, big tectonic shifts need to be advanced to make that happen. But we're seeing new narratives that it may be very far from, the gap between rhetoric and reality may be still huge, but we're seeing narratives that can be used against power holders and used to hold them to account. We're seeing coalitions, we're seeing convergences that weren't there before. And the panel has also been excellent at teasing out some concrete entry points or wedge issues, from vaccine inequality to resistance to austerity, to issues of debt justice. We've been inspired to think about these concrete wedges that can help to advance these bigger ideas. And we've been looking at what some of those bigger, more inspirational propositional framings could be. I want to thank the panelists. Thank you, Jayati. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Max. I should also say it's very notable that we have not had an African perspective on this panel. And I just want to say that as many of you may have seen from the publicity on this event, we were originally hoping to have Winnie Byanyima joining us from UNAIDS. Unfortunately, she had to pull out at the last minute, but I wanted to underscore that because the organizers were very concerned to have an African perspective on the panel. In the end, it wasn't possible, but I think the richness of the panel that we did have more than amply compensates. Thank you to the organizers, to OHCHR and to UN Women, to Salian, to Laura, to Craig, and to others who put their energies into this event. And lastly, thank you to all the participants, the many of you who have participated, who've asked very thoughtful questions and raised very thoughtful questions also in the, very thoughtful comments also in the chat. So thank you, and onwards and upwards to a rights-based economy.
A luta continua. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.